Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Career Journey Podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Avila. On today's episode, we have Zoë Björnson, and she is a UX/UI designer and currently the head of product at Quilt. You can find her at KZOEB on Instagram, Twitter, and at kzoeb.com. And it was really fun getting to chat with Zoë because UX, UI design and research is kind of this emerging field for psychology majors. And if you've listened to this podcast, you know that I'm a psychology professor. If you haven't, I'm a psychology professor. And a lot of friends that I had that went to school went into UX, UI design. And it's an interesting area full of understanding how people interact with products and technology and basically how people think and feel and interact with the world. And it's a really exciting place for psychology majors, and it's full of good money as well. And another thing that I really enjoyed about our conversation is Zoë is currently working on a project about habits. And so we got to bond over our love of habit formation and habit creation and all of this stuff, because I'm working on a book that talks about habits for studying, and Zoe's looking at habits in terms of products and lifestyle and business and everything else. And so that was a lot of fun. We talked about being who you are, being your authentic self, being vulnerable in terms of networking, and how being authentic and true to yourself can really help propel your networking ability, which sometimes when you have imposter syndrome seems a little counterintuitive. But Zoë goes on to explain how being vulnerable and how allowing your authentic true self to shine through can really advance your networking skills. And I think it's just invaluable advice. So without further ado, please enjoy Zoë Björnson. Hey everyone, welcome to the Career Journey Podcast, where we explore exciting careers and how to get them from the people who've lived it. I'm your host, Dr. Brittany Avila. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy. All right. Hi, Zoë. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So usually I start off by asking people what they wanted to be as a child, but I'm going to hold off on that question really quick because I just wanted to state how excited I am for this conversation. So I was a psychology major. Obviously, teach psychology now at a university. Mm-hmm. And UX, UI kind of research is this up and coming branch that so many psychology majors are going into. I have a ton of friends from my undergrad days, my college, my graduate days that have gone into this field, and it's always this like enticing, come make money, make more money over here. There's actual like money to be made type of career. And so I'm excited to hear more about it. And then I was also just exploring your website, and I saw that you are creating an app or a design for habits, for creating and keeping habits. And this is a research literature I have been diving into for the past year because I'm writing a book on studying habits and how to use habit formations and habit loops and all of those things you talked about on your website in order to study more effectively. And so I was really excited to see that you're creating an app, because now I can just direct students straight to that. So
I need to find a developer to build the app first, but we're ready. It can happen.
Awesome. All right, now love letter to you aside, I'll start with my initial question, which is, I doubt you wanted to be in UX design when you were a kid, because I don't think it really existed at that point. So what did you think you might do when you were a child?
When I was a kid, it's funny, we were actually talking about this on the Quilt app the other day. When I was a kid, I wanted to work at SeaWorld. I wanted to like swim with Shamu, and that's so like, SeaWorld is now the devil, and whales should not be in tanks, and yada, yada, yada. But when I was a kid, I was just so enthralled by this other world, and didn't even want to be a marine biologist, just wanted to like put on a show and dive around a tank with a giant marine animal. So yeah, it has nothing to do with UX, UI, or product. And to be frank, I mean, I don't think I even knew that UX, UI, or product management was a thing when I graduated college. It's something that I personally fell into. I think a lot of folks in UX specifically kind of fell into it as well, because there are so many paths that make sense for a UX designer to come from, psychology being one of them. I love when I talk to people who have spent time in customer support, because that's literally the best place to be, to understand someone's problems and be able to fix them, and coming from that angle. So yeah, nothing in relation to UX, UI, tech, or product, just wanting to hang out with sea life.
That's awesome. And so obviously there was no direct major for that in college. So what did you decide to major in?
In college, I majored in communications. I feel like I was pretty split between wanting to study business and marketing. I think when I was in college, it was right when influencers were really becoming a thing, and early days of that, and social media was really starting to take off. Like, people were kind of starting to make money off of Instagram and things like that. And I thought I wanted to do social media for the rest of my life. Like, I thought I wanted to build a brand and do that. And that was marketing at its core. And so didn't really want to get a business degree per se. Didn't feel like spending time in Excel and economics and things like that. But I was super fascinated by psychology, and have always been, and just kind of the science of why we do the things that we do. And at the university that I went to Tulane in New Orleans, and communications at that school was more along the lines of just that, like the science behind why people communicate in ways that they do, strategies of communication. So it had a little bit of this marketing business side mixed with psychology. So it was really perfect for me in what I wanted to do out of college, which was more in this like social media community management realm, and today. And we've got barking dogs, so okay, I think they're fine now. But yeah, communication for me at Tulane just made a lot of sense, and was really supportive, and continues to be supportive as I work with different people, and as I understand different ways of working, and just kind of everything under the sun. It's so vague, but for me, it worked out.
And so where did you go directly out of college? Did you go straight into UX experience? UX, it sounds like you might have went somewhere else first.
I did. I bounced around quite a bit. And my first job out of college, I worked in college, and I had internships mostly in kind of marketing and communications. And out of college, I took a job at a startup called About.me, which is kind of like a website platform, and a simplified version of sharing your online presence. And I started as, I think my title was like college outreach coordinator. So I was working with college students and trying to get them onto the platform. So it was this mix of marketing and guerrilla marketing and communication in general in its simplest form. And it was a startup, and we were a tech company. And so I got pretty cozy with doing user research before I even knew what I was doing. I was working with developers, I was working with designers, I was working with product people. I was surrounded by the startup world and, venture-backed startups. So I just started learning anything and everything, and became kind of this Jane of all trades, and then really fell in love with the UX process, and this kind of way of just constantly learning and iterating and changing. And I just loved that ability to identify a problem and then say, okay, let's figure out a solution, put the solution out there, learn from it. If it works, awesome. If it doesn't work, you still learn, and do it again. Like, that iterative process and being able to put something out into the world was so rewarding for me. And it was something I didn't really get to feel when I was doing more of like the social media stuff, because it was so ephemeral. But with UX and with product, whether it's a website or an app, or even if you're doing like physical product development, which is a totally different type of user experience, it's just so cool to be able to point to something and be like, we made this, like we built this, we designed this. And it came from this mixture of science and intuition and research and data and all these things, perfect storm, built something. I just find that to be so, so cool. And so I kind of fell into it during my time at About Me, and then got really intrigued by UX and wanted to dive in further. And my career kind of took a couple of turns from there, but it's been an interesting one, to say the least.
So I want to ask a little bit about what it's like to work at a startup, because I feel like there's just so many of them now that it's likely people are going to go into that. What is it like to work at a startup? Is it different than working at a more kind of fully formed company, and how?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my experience, I've worked post-college, I've worked at 4 different companies. 2 of them have been startups and 2 of them have been agencies. So I don't have like a big corporate experience to really draw from. So I don't even know what it's like in that league. But to me, working at a startup means that anything could change on a dime. That could be the process that you adhere to for one project or next. It could be the metric that you're kind of goaling at and you're hoping to solve and kind of unlock and see change. It could be your team structure. Like, you have to kind of always be on your toes and be excited to pivot when and where that's needed. And that's something that even at agencies that are not ridiculously old by any means and, you know, stuck in their ways, have trouble with the agility and that kind of like a beautiful chaos, I guess you could say. It's hard for some of those companies because the processes that they've put in place are what make them run on a regular basis and what makes it all feasible. And it's kind of, they have their own beautiful chaos. Whereas at a startup, you have to have like just enough process, but be okay with whatever you have changing at a moment's notice, or becoming something different, or throwing it all out the window. And I think with startups, what I find really beautiful about them is that if you have an idea, you can most likely turn it into a reality much sooner than you'd imagine if you have a supportive team and if you have the right support around you and the right capabilities around you than you can anywhere else. There's just not, you know, company politics, and there's not stakeholders that you have to get approvals by. It's kind of like, if you have an idea and you've got either the research to prove it or the intuition sometimes to prove it, you can make it happen. And I just think that's really fun, and it's really rewarding when it works.
Yeah. And then, so you mentioned earlier that your career kind of took a few twists and turns after this first job at About.me. So I want to get into that a little bit. Where did you go right after that job?
Yeah, so I was at About.me for a little over 3.5 years, and about a year and change of my time there, I was working remotely. So before COVID and before that was the norm for a lot of us. And I was working remotely and I was traveling all around the world. And it was one of the most like rewarding experiences of my life. And working for a startup, it was easy to do that because, like I said, we didn't have rules and processes around everything. So once I got back from traveling and kind of having that nomad life, I knew I wanted to dive deeper into UX and learn more and really immerse myself. And I also kind of wanted that real job experience, like in an office and you know, having that kind of lifestyle. So I moved to New York, applied to a ton of jobs, and ended up landing at a user experience design and development agency called Beyond. And we did a lot of work specifically with Google. That was my main client. And I was actually a technical project manager, or digital producer, as they called it at the time there. So I was managing a dev team. I wasn't necessarily doing user research myself, but I learned so much about working with clients. I had never worked with clients before, and that dynamic and the stakeholders, and I had never worked with a company as big as Google before, so the ins and outs of that lifestyle and what needs to happen and the processes there. And then also just working with developers. I am a firm believer, to be a great designer, to be a great developer, to be a great product person, you need to have like 25 to 30% of knowledge in the other person's field. So I'm not a developer and I can't really develop, but I need to understand how they work and speak their language in order to be successful in my role. And so that job really taught me how to do all of that and more. And also just learn some of the design thinking processes and functions and brainstorm techniques that agencies use to get to the crux of an innovative idea. So Beyond was really a big piece of kind of like sculpting my knowledge of UX and actually deciding that I was like, yes, this is something I really want to dive into, and this is something that I'm curious about. And I spent about a year at Beyond. You learn so much at agencies and so much in so little time before I moved to a different agency that was a little bit more focused on direct to consumer and startup companies. And so they were more physical products. And I was a product manager and learned a ton there, and working with like kind of like cross collaborating. So we were working with production teams and you know, branding teams and things like that. And it was a little bit outside of my comfort zone because I was more in the tech wheelhouse, you could say. So I spent a bit of time there before deciding that, you know what, I don't want to be a project manager anymore. I really want to hone my skills as a designer and like a product person who's coming up with ideas and executing on those ideas rather than organizing someone else's ideas is kind of what project management felt like to me at the time. So I pivoted and took some time off and moved out of New York and just like did a whole refresh of my life. Again, that's a little theme for me, and took a design boot camp. And I had worked in all these roles that were so like relative and had meaning in terms of UX, but I had never built a portfolio for myself. So I took the time to really do that and dive a bit deeper into the creative side of UX, because I have the knowledge when it comes to product and strategy, but I was like, oh, I want to really hone and sharpen that design, like UX UI design sword.
Great. And is that where you're at currently?
No. So I graduated from my design boot camp. I'm like, no, we're not done yet. I graduated from my boot camp last June, I believe it was. And I had been networking as much as possible, meeting new people. Pandemic hits. That obviously changes things. But I had actually been doing a lot of sessions online through this company called Quilt when they were doing online gatherings via Zoom, and got connected to the team, got connected to the founder, Ashley, and had a couple conversations with Ashley. And it just so happened they were looking for someone who could do product management, product strategy, and product design at the time. And it was like match made in heaven, perfect, perfect time, perfect person. So I've been at Quilt since August of last year, and I'm the head of product at Quilt, and I've been doing everything under the sun from product management to product design. I'm shifting my role to be a little bit more focused specifically in product management, but I've been designing the app and interviewing users and doing UX UI up until now. So I think for me, it was really a beautiful moment of combining all my experience into one, which I feel really lucky to have happened, and felt really far away from for a really long time. And so to have it happen during a pandemic and right after I graduated this boot camp that I didn't know if I was going to get a job from, it was pretty magical in my perspective.
Can you walk us through a little bit about what your day-to-day life or your day-to-day work is like? I imagine it differs from day to day, but kind of in a nutshell, what types of things you do for your current career?
Great question. It definitely does change from day to day and week to week. This week, we are doing a lot of research, which is really exciting. So this week, my week has consisted of putting together research plans for the specific kind of hypotheses we're trying to prove or disprove, conducting a couple of those interviews alongside another member of our product team. I've also am fleshing out product requirements documents. So I'm doing research in terms of what's technically possible. I'm looking through competitive analysis and competitive research to see how these problems or these challenges are being solved in other apps. Every morning we have a scrum with our dev team, and so we're just updating everyone on the status of what's being built. We just released a version of the app Quilt to the App Store, so I was like writing the release notes and designing the social assets that are going to get shared. So for me, it's really everything under the sun. And because it's a social app and because that's the product that we're working with. It's not like we have a desktop and an Android and everything. It's just one iOS app. It's anything that really touches the product. Is something that I'm supporting on in some way, shape, or form. And the other piece about UX UI that I think isn't really spoken a lot about, UX UI and or product, is research is a really big and a really vague category. So I can say I'm doing research and it could be like, oh, okay, what kind of research are you doing? Are you doing a focus group? Are you doing a survey? Are you doing usability tests? Are you doing user research interviews? Are you doing A/B tests? Like there's such a ton of things you can do. And I mean, my week consists of sometimes a mix of multiple ones. But another piece that I get really excited about, because I think it's the beautiful like cross section of innovation, or like intuition in innovation and data, is when we get to run experiments and test things in the product and see how people respond. So a lot of my time is spent there, because as much as I would love to build, or not myself, but have our developers build every single thing that crosses my mind, it's very expensive and time intensive to do so. So something we do a lot at Quilt and at other companies that I worked with as well is experiment with the tools at our disposal. So the analytics and notification or messaging tool that we have, it's like, okay, if our goal is getting people to share with a friend, like how can we inspire them to do that, and setting certain notifications and configuring the experiment or experience to do that. So a lot of the experiments we do have a big impact on what we build and are part of like validation of an overall opportunity or challenge that we're looking at.
And then I'm fascinated with this because research obviously is one of my areas of specialization. This is why a lot of psychologists are attracted to UX UI in the first place. But with the research we do, we have a lot of governing boards. We have like the institutional review board, the IRB that we have to go through. We have to get grants and funding from all of these different types of people. I imagine in your field that looks a little bit different. Are there any like oversight boards, ethics boards, or anything like that, or you just do what research you want to do?
It's a lot more free, it sounds, but we it depends on the product that you're working with. I think first of all, if you were working for a bank, you would probably have to go through different types of boards or kind of steps to make sure that everything, you crossing your dotting your I's and crossing your T's. At Quilt specifically, because we are a startup and we have a very engaged community, we're lucky in that like a lot of people want to give us feedback. That's not always the case with research. Sometimes it's like pulling teeth. Yes. I've definitely been in that scenario before. But for us, we don't make anyone sign a contract. We really just like state everything that's going to happen in the interview beforehand, and we'll kind of do a checklist of like, is this okay to record, and getting consent and all that jazz. And it's really just about making that person feel comfortable. And I think some of like more of the governance boards are in favor of that, from my understanding. But I do know like as you kind of like level up, it's more and more important to make sure you're really checking off all those boxes with research, so that you're not getting any issues down the line.
Sued or something later on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And then earlier you mentioned kind of this distinction between doing UX UI for like tech companies like you're currently at versus companies that create more of a tangible product. And yep. It sounded like you worked for a company briefly that produced kind of a tangible product. What are the differences between the job when it's kind of a tech product versus a more tangible product?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's something I don't know a ton about, because I've really only been in the like responsible seat or whatever you want to call it for the tech product arena. Right. But I mean, usability for physical products is such a real thing, and it comes a lot more down to like design and like the physical feeling of something. Like I feel like IDEO does a ton of this, and like that kitchen brand OXO, they're always coming out with new different like shapes of how to open a can opener, or
Right.
unscrew a bottle of wine. And that's a whole other world, because you have to truly study like how someone opens and changes things. Like, why is a cup shaped a certain way? Why is a mug shaped a certain way? I think what's really interesting is when you get into the cross section of technology and physical products, so like wearables, or like I've got the Apple AirPods, and I remember when a friend first got them, when I was playing around with them, the most intriguing thing to me was how you could flick open the case back and forth, and that magnetic like pull. It was almost like addicting, and it was like, did they design this with that intention,
Yes,
so that you'd want to kind of like, yeah, you'd want to like
yes,
fumble with it? It's like a fidget spinner or whatever they're called. And so there's a lot of that too. And it's like, does that enhance the usability of a technical product? Like, am I much more likely to pick up that than my headphones that plug into my computer? And I think that that's where it gets really interesting, and where the minds meet in a way. Like, you have to have a technical UX designer to kind of connect the Bluetooth to the phone, but then when it comes to the physical touching of something, it's a different story. But I do remember at that specific agency, they just had tons of, when I say prototypes, I think of like a Figma document or like a technical prototype, but in their world, it would be like boxes and different packaging solutions, and different, jars for the jam that someone was making, or whatever it might be, but making it interesting so that it's usable, but also fun and different and innovative.
And that's another area that UX, UI, and psychology kind of intersect. We have an area of psychology. Well, we have an area of psychology for everything. But it's called human factors. And it's essentially exactly that. It's studying ergonomically, how do people interact with the world? How do people interact with products? And I remember there's this one study that we all cite when we teach about human factors, that is basically, there was a certain airplane, I don't remember the model type, but pilots kept kind of almost crashing before even taking off, and they couldn't figure out why. And so human factors psychologists came in to research it, and they ended up finding out that there was like a button that they had to push that was so awkwardly out of place that they kept forgetting to push it. And so they just had to move one button, and all of a sudden all those crashes stopped. And so figuring out how we interact with the world can have consequences. And even anything like your AirPods case, I mean, Apple has an amazing team of psychologists and researchers on their team. But yeah, it's exactly designed to get you to continue thinking about it and holding it and showing it and keeping it. And so it's fascinating.
Oh, interesting. Wow. It's the opposite of big red button syndrome. It's like button too far away, and thus detrimental impact. That's fascinating.
Yeah, like they have psychologists that work in human factors. I think it's always really cool to mention that work at NASA to make sure that astronauts can interact with their environment in the most efficient way possible. But it's the same thing with kind of UX, UI, is you're essentially trying to figure out, even with the tech, I think you're trying to figure out, how do people interact with this, and how do we get them to interact as efficiently as possible?
Exactly. And I think on a much smaller scale, it's like when you think about what your thumb can reach on an iPhone, and designing with that in mind, and making the most accessible as close as possible, and the stuff that you don't really want people to touch as far away as possible. And sometimes it's hard to think about that when you're designing, but when you actually hold something in your hand, it has a very different effect on how you think and how you create.
Like how companies will make it extremely difficult to unsubscribe from their email list because you're more likely to drop off in the process.
That too.
And so what are you kind of currently working on? I know I saw, again, on your website, I saw that app for habits. Are there certain things that you're currently working on that you're allowed to tell us about?
Yeah, the habit design was part of my final project for the bootcamp that I did last year, and I've been speaking with a couple of developers to to figure out how that can come to life. I love talking about habits, and I'm just constantly learning more and more about that. And I mean, that's part of, honestly, like the human factor there too. I would assume it's like how our brains actually understand information and start to build habits around anything from brushing your teeth to using a certain app, and like reading something is totally fascinating to me. And it's a lot of what I try to bring into my work. But the company I work at now, Quilt, we are building an audio only social network for supportive conversations, where we really believe that community is part of your self-care. So there's been a lot of audio only social apps in the game. Clubhouse is a big one that has seen a ton of growth. And so it's a really exciting place to be, because there are so many players in the game, and it's a new type of behavior around social networking and connection that we have never really had before. Everything else was more static and a little less collaborative. And so it's a really fun space to be in. And I'm, currently working on the product and figuring out what we're going to build next. But we've had some awesome growth in the past couple months, and I'm just excited to see where this space goes next, because it's like podcasting. It's like, I don't know who the first podcaster was, but look at us now. Everyone listens to podcasts on their walk, on their drive, while they're working, and it's really sort of changed the game. And so audio social takes it a bit to the next level and makes it more engaging and a place to go and have conversations. And really what the crux of Quilt is about, and why I love doing these podcasts with folks too, is because these are the conversations that you're not having on a regular basis. And it's like, how do we make these types of conversations almost a habit, and something that we integrate into our daily life, and that's what we're trying to build over at Quilt.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And earlier you talked about you were in kind of the project management side, and then you wanted to go over into more of that design side. And then it sounded like here you're kind of combining, or is that right, that you're combining kind of design and project management?
In a way, it's more design and product management. So it really depends on the company and how they're set up. Project management, product management can sort of fuse into one. It can be two totally separate entities in a way. They can support each other. But project management, when it comes down to it, is like taking a goal and breaking it down and making sure that the team delivers on whatever that is. So planning and supporting in accomplishing goals or deliverables based on the priority, and really just being like the team glue. And so I did that for about 1.5 years, and learned so much from those teams, and really enjoyed that. And also taking like the communication and psychology information that I've learned over the years. Like, I'm a really big Myers-Briggs nerd, and like I just Enneagram, anything like that. I love learning that about other people, so I can kind of like, oh, okay, they're an introvert. This is how I should sort of work around them and whatnot. And with the project management, it's more about making a team work, whereas product management is a lot of times it's referred to being the CEO of a product. So you're making the decisions, likely with support from leaders and stakeholders on what to build and what that consists of, and what the MVP or minimum viable product is going to be. So I've been doing a bit more of that product management in addition to UX UI design, to really figure out what's next for Quilt. Like, what are we building next? What makes the most sense to build based on our goals, based on our user feedback? And I really enjoy doing that, because you can come at it from these 3 sort of angles, which is what I believe a great product person kind of consists of, which is like, it's almost like I don't know if there's a name for this, but a Venn diagram, but with 3 circles is how I kind of like to think about it. But the Venn diagram includes this technical knowledge, so understanding what's technically feasible, how do you do it, what's the operational and like the mechanics of everything, the design, so UX, UI, how does it look, how does it feel, and then business or strategy and kind of the business goals, and product sort of sits right in the middle of all of those. And if you can sort of make it all swirl together in some sort of beautiful fashion, then it all works nicely.
And then I'm going to ask a question that might be a little bit tricky, but
Hmm.
You mentioned earlier there's a, many different ways that you can do research in this area, from focus groups to surveys, etc. And I know that within psychology, we also have a plethora of different ways to research, and we often have kind of our favorite methods. Do you
Hmm.
have a favorite kind of research method that you enjoy doing?
That's a fun question. Um, Honestly, I think my favorite is just interviewing folks. I love talking to people and like teasing out their answers and figuring out what they actually mean with whatever they say. I find that if I do a survey or I do a focus group, I always want to know more. Like I never get enough. Whereas if I have 30 minutes with someone and I know what I'm trying to understand about their experience, I can really get to the crux of it all and figure out what that is. I think that was toying between saying just user research and interviews versus usability testing, which is watching someone go through something you've designed or supported in building and designing. And I find that to be a little frustrating because you're like, just click the button on the top right. And you can't say that to them.
Right,
So I like that really like exploratory, like tell me about your problems, tell me about your day. Like it's almost like a therapy session in some ways for some
right.
people because they're just dumping it all on you in the best way possible. So I think that's really my favorite form. Although I hate listening to my voice and the recording of the interviews afterwards because it's just like,
Yeah.
ooh, or you forget to ask a question or something. But I think that would probably be my favorite form of research.
Yeah, and humans are notoriously bad at understanding why we do things. So when you just survey
Hmm.
them, they tend to be wrong. We've learned that a lot in
Exactly.
psychology. So having that
Exactly.
interview, you're able to really get a little bit deeper and figure out what the truth is sometimes when
Yep.
we
You can
don't
get
know.
those five whys in, like, well, why did you do that? And why did you do that? And I think it's
Right.
what's interesting over the years as I've been doing more and more research is I found that people's memories really isn't that great. Because if you start with like, okay, you did this on a Tuesday, tell me what you had for breakfast that morning, they'll be like, no
No.
idea.
Yep. I lecture on memory every year, and students are always flabbergasted when when I basically explain how terrible our memories are. They just they're not as
Yeah,
accurate as we like to think they are.
no way, no way.
And then how does it end up translating? What goes on in between doing this type of research and figuring out what people need, how they interact with it, what works best, to getting that product out there?
That's a great question. And I think it really depends on the company and also what you're trying to learn. So at Quilt, we did a round of user research back in the fall to really understand the experience that people were having on the app. And we're just like, are we achieving what we're setting out to achieve? So we're kind of like, we put this out into the world, we've gotten X amount of users. Is it landing in the way that we thought was landing? So it was kind of a form of validation. So we did a round of interviews to kind of understand that experience that people were having. What were some of these the pros, what were some of the cons, and a lot of actionable steps came out of that. It wasn't necessarily like, okay, we're looking to validate this idea and so we can build this. It was like, let's just see if we're doing the right thing. And that's the fun part about startups. You can just really be like, we're going to throw this at the wall and see if it sticks and find out afterwards. For some of the other features that we build, we'll have these conversations around trying to understand a motivation or a challenge a user is particularly having. So when I did a lot of the projects in my design bootcamp, it was taking a specific challenge that I just saw out in the world, like I did for the habits. It was like, how do you track your habits? Tell me about that process for you. And as people would tell you about the process, you would start to understand the challenges and the problems that they have with their current process or their current lack of process. And so that's like an opportunity. That's where you build from. You identify the place that people are struggling and give them a solution for that. A lot of people don't need solutions for things they already have solutions for. So that's kind of, I always love when you see a startup matrix and it's like the Uber for delivering dog food, or it's like all that
Right.
kind of stuff where you're matching it up and it's like, it's satire, but at the same time, it's some random type of solution for a challenge that someone might be having. So with those interviews, the ideal sort of scenario is You do the research, you figure out the problem or the challenge someone's having, you design some sort of solution, and then you test it again. And you're kind of like, is this supporting? Is this solving? If it's a new product, you're designing from scratch. If it's an existing one, it's kind of like an iteration. Is this making the goal easier or better? Is this easier to log your habits? Is this harder to log your habits? Are you expecting something different? And that's where it gets kind of fun, even though usability tests can be sometimes frustrating, is to really tease out like what someone is expecting or needing from an experience. And I can guarantee that nobody said to Snapchat, I need a fire emoji to signify the streak that I have with my best friend for the past 62 days. But that was kind of probably a mix of business goals and design or experience getting into one, because you can bet your bottom dollar that their metrics in terms of daily use went up because people were trying to get their streaks to stay longer. So they're coming back, they're returning. But then from a psychological perspective, you're like, you get attached to that and you like to see that number grow. You see progress and you see that you're like achieving or unlocking something. I don't use Snapchat on a regular basis, so who knows what it looks like now, but I remember that being like a subconscious desire for me to keep this streak going. And so I think what comes out of the research is like understanding either the user problem or the business problem or both, figuring out a solution and then seeing how the user responds, putting it out into the world, and like doing the whole thing over again. So with product and tech in particular, it's really an iterative process that you're never done with. You're constantly learning and you're constantly making updates and testing and experimenting based on what you're learning.
And that was kind of my next question, is it's basically never done. As long as kind of the tech is out there, you're always going to be iterating some type of new version to meet demand or to meet new metrics that you've uncovered. Exactly. Do you know, like, how do you actually get a product then to launch? Like, do you ever feel, I feel like in psychology, we would be very hesitant until it's like perfect. It's like, it can't get out there until it's perfect. And how do you get to that stage where you kind of let it go out? Is it easier because you constantly still have people reviewing and so you know you're updating it?
It's a couple things. I think the biggest solution or way to kind of combat that perfectionism that maybe comes out in some of us and wanting to like have a fully wrapped product before we share it with the world is what is called in the tech world is like MVP mindset, or again, minimum viable product. And one of the ways it was explained to me years ago was by going back to the user's goal. So if you tell me, hey Zoe, I need to get from home to the grocery store, which is 5 miles away, 3 times a week, and that's my challenge. That's what I need from you. And I could either sit here and draw up a Lamborghini and be like, Brittany's going to drive in style to the grocery store. It's going to take her 2 minutes. She's going to go from 0 to 60 and, gosh knows how short of a time frame. Or I could say, okay, let me give you a skateboard. Let me get a piece of wood. Let me nail some wheels on it and just see what you do with it. Doing the skateboard example would take me a lot less longer than building you a Lamborghini or Ferrari or whatever car I decided to come up with on that day. And I would observe you. I would be like, here's your skateboard. Go, go take it, see what happens. And you would say, you know what? It took me too long. My leg hurt. Then it rained. I didn't have anywhere to put my bags. And I would be like, okay, so we need some sort of cover. We need some sort of basket. What's a priority here? The basket or the cover? What's going to be more important to you as a user? And you'd be like, well, I don't want to carry all my groceries. Like, give me the basket and I just won't go to the store when it rains. So then I would build you a bike. And then you would use the bike and let's say you live in Chicago and it gets cold and you would be like, no, I really need some cover or something like that. And so then, we would give you a golf cart and it would go down the line of like these increasingly usable, but also more complex options that would solve the one problem that you have. So a constant challenge for people in product, and where sometimes product and designers can butt head, is like, how complex does it need to be in order to get the job done that you've set out to accomplish for the user? Like, you just asked me, you need to get from A to B. You didn't ask me that you didn't say you needed to get from A to B in 60 seconds. You just said you needed to get there. So it's really about narrowing down those parameters and understanding where you're accomplishing the goal, where you're over delivering, and then if you still need to like get further or closer to the goal that's valuable and usable to the user, how do you prioritize those next?
That's a really good analogy. I like that a lot.
I wish I could remember who told it to me. I think there's also tons of visuals online, so I can't take credit for that one, but it's really helpful for me when I need to like come back to simplicity and just be like, well, what's the challenge? Are you solving the challenge in the simplest way possible? Because I think, again, in the startup world, you only have so many resources. You only have so much time. Sometimes you only have so much money, so many people. And so prioritization is a big part of the job, and you need the entire team to understand that. And so when a designer or developer can really tap into that mindset of MVP and prioritization based on the user's goals and the jobs that they really need to complete, or we call them jobs to be done, the better. And the more your team can move faster because you're all on the same page there.
And I know your route was a little bit different, and you mentioned that there might be different ways to get into this career, but somebody who's out there listening saying, "Ooh, I want to get into UX UI," what are some ways that they could get into this career?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I went the bootcamp route, which is really popular for everything from tech to for like coding to product management to design. I did have a background in tech, so I wasn't starting from zero or coming from a totally different arena. I think it's a great place to learn a lot in a short amount of time. I also think that there's a lot of adjacent roles or industries or paths that can be super, super relevant and super supportive to anyone in UX UI. I mentioned earlier, customer support is a big one. When you think about it, customer support is like at its crux, understanding a user's problem or a customer's problem and trying to fix it as best as possible with the limited resources that you do have. So a lot of people who come from that discipline have so much empathy for the user, and that's really what user experience is. It's not business goals, it's not technical feasibility, it's empathy for a user and their problems and solving them. So I think that's a great path if you're already in that, or you kind of you identify, let's say you want to work for a Facebook or an Amazon or whatever, is on the charts these days, and you don't quite have the skill set to get a job in UX UI. Customer support is honestly a great place to start, and you learn the industry, you learn the company, and then you can, hopefully ladder around from there. I see a lot of folks who actually come from like service jobs, so restaurant industry. It's another form of customer support in a way, like the customer is always right. So if you're in that realm, I would totally encourage you to apply for any other roles when it comes to UX UI. I think, anyone from a development perspective or other design disciplines is really primed to be in UX UI, but it's really something I think we all can tap into. I did a podcast interview a couple of years back, and I remember making a statement around how my grandmother was the first ever UX designer because she totally designed her kitchen at the time based on herself, and she had a board to pull out to stand on so she could reach the cupboards up high. She instead of just releasing the dead space that was in the corner of the kitchen, she built one of those turntables underneath the cabinets. So she was just doing all these crazy things that made sense for her and made sense for how she was going to use a space. And so we're all really product designers, and we all really are like product thinkers and UX designers. So even if you come from a different discipline or a different world, just starting to think in that way is in auditing the apps that you use on a regular basis is a great place to start. And I mean, psychology and that world is an obvious in for me, because you're already in the minds of people. And so taking it a step further into the mind of a specific user is all the better.
Yeah. And then my last question for you is, if you had kind of one big piece of career advice that you could give to people starting out, transitioning, or just in their careers, what would that piece of advice be?
That's a good question. A very tricky one. I'm going to give two, if that's okay. My that's first allowed. One, and this good. I'm glad I'm not breaking the rules. My first one is both life and career, and it's something that I've said over and over again because it was said over and over again to me, and that is to wake up and spend 30 minutes on airplane mode every single day. I think if you, as it was shared to me by an old manager of mine, if you wake up and you let thousands of people yell at you through a tiny screen before you even decide what you're going to have for breakfast or what your first action of the day is going to be, you're letting go so much of your power and so much of just your way of being that isn't needed. So you're like clouding your space before you've had a chance to do anything else. And that has been really supportive advice for me on both a personal level and also professional, because if you're checking your phone and you're checking your emails and you're, seeing all these things come in, you're not allowing yourself to really like sit in what's right for you and what's meant for you. So that's like more of a lifestyle advice that I would recommend to everyone.
Very good advice.
It's hard sometimes because we all want to see what's up in the world and in our worlds and the big world, but it's definitely something that's been really powerful. And the second piece of advice is a bit of a harder one, but I have found the roles that I've been most excited about and the opportunities, whether they're roles or not, that I've been most excited about through my community and through the people who know me. And I have never been a big fan of networking in like the gross ways and going to events and putting on the name tag and talking about my job in a way that doesn't feel natural. And if you can find ways that feel natural to you, that mean connecting with other humans in a field that you want to be in, that's going to set you up for the most success. And not only doing that and going to those events or going on those Zoom calls or whatever it might be in today's world, but also getting into those spaces with a mindset of authenticity and vulnerability. When I was like doing this course and figuring out my next step and pivoting into more UX, UI and product, I was super vocal about what I was doing. I wasn't trying to hide the fact that I was in this space of learning, and I had quit my job and I was unemployed and, XYZ. I was just like, this is what I'm doing and I'm so excited. And if you know anyone, please connect me and da-da-da-da-da. And through one of the accountability groups that I was in through what is now the old version of a Quilt, I met someone who worked at Quilt, and then she introduced me to the founder, and that got me the job. And it was because I was so open and vulnerable with my state, I guess you could say, that I was able to make those connections. And I think sometimes in the tech world especially, and also especially for women, we can be very, we can keep things close to our chest, and we can not pretend, but like want to hide our vulnerabilities. Like I see a lot of women nowadays not disclosing their graduation year on LinkedIn because they maybe want to appear older. I don't know if the psychology is there, but it's like we have a tendency to like hide these pieces of ourselves that may not be as attractive, or we assume are not as attractive to others. And I'm like, just put it all out there and see what bites, because we're all humans. We're just having a human experience, and we just need to be a bit more vulnerable. And I think vulnerability is what really breeds connection and community with others. And if you're trying to breed community, don't be fake, don't be someone that you're not, be who you are and see who that resonates with. And that could be like a relationship and a partnership in terms of like your intimate life, but it could also be a business opportunity or a job opportunity. So I think being vulnerable and being open to those types of connections and being authentic in how you network and meet new people is kind of this unsung secret of the job world, and something I wish I knew earlier, because I definitely fell into the like, gotta wear my white button up and to the networking event and chug along there, and that's not me, and that's okay.
And I think that's great advice, and I think that part of it, especially for the younger people, I remember from my own personal experience, it's imposter syndrome in a way. Like, I felt so out of place and too young, and like I didn't belong, and so I wanted to be more professional. If I just acted older, if I just acted smarter, if I kept that part of me kind of hidden away, then people would take me seriously and I could succeed and I could network or I could do things. And even just in my career as a teacher, I remember my first few semesters of teaching, I was so close in age to the students. I was trying to like appear older and smarter so that they would take me seriously and respect me. And then now the irony, and every teacher knows this, every year you get further and further away from the age of your students, and the ability to connect to them slips away. And it's actually those first few years that you're kind of most effective, because you have that rare authenticity, transparency. You can connect on more of a personal level. And so it's kind of a shame that we waste some of that time with kind of hiding ourselves in order to appear better or smarter or more capable or whatever it is. And I'm a huge fan of transparency. It's one of the reasons I started this podcast, and I do it in my teaching, much to the chagrin of some other people, some other mindsets. But without that authenticity and that transparency, you're not having a real connection, like you said.
Exactly. And I think that is a thread that's, again, not only business or job related. It's something that can carry you through and create so many more opportunities than it would should you just try to like act like someone that you're not, whether that's more professional or older, or I think that there's also, especially for women, like this feeling or need to act. Well, it could go both ways. You need to be like the people pleaser, and like this maternal energy might come out for some people. And on the other side, you might be like, no, I need to be more masculine, and I need to be like hands on my hips and things like that. And it's just like, be whoever you are, and you'll attract the right people. Be who you're not, and you're probably going to attract the wrong people, which is going to lead to an unhappy experience or relationship or whatever it might be. And that can be kind of like a hard pill to swallow, because not everyone in this world is acting in that mindset. So you might run into a couple walls in the road, so to speak, where you're like, oh, wait, everyone in this industry acts like this. And then you're like, well, maybe I'm not supposed to be in this industry.
Right. Well, that's excellent advice. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And I'm happy to also connect with anyone who is interested in the UXUI world. You can find me all over the web at KZoeB, or I'm sure there'll be links in the podcast, but I'm happy to share with anyone my experience in on a deeper level, or answer any questions, or maybe connect you to anyone who I know.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, of course.
Thank you for listening to the Career Journey Podcast. Head over to our website at careerjourneypodcast.com for more information and the latest episodes. See you next time.